It was a night that could have ended everything. A night when the future of Thriller, the album destined to redefine music history, hung by a thread. The air in the studio was electric, but not the kind that inspires creativity. It crackled with tension, anger, and the silent threat of disaster. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, stood in the center of it all, eyes sharp, posture rigid, a man whose brilliance often walked hand in hand with torment. Around him, the producers and engineers, people who had guided the sounds of legends, felt the weight of history pressing down. And they knew that one wrong word could ignite a chain reaction that might destroy more than a song. It could shatter an entire career. The story of Thriller's creation has always been told as a triumph, a tale of genius and vision. But no one ever talks about the night when it almost didn't happen. The night when voices rose, hearts raced, and the dream of the biggest album in history nearly dissolved into chaos. There were whispers of betrayal, rumors of sabotage, and secrets kept behind closed doors, stories only a few insiders have ever dared to tell. And tonight, for the first time, we dive into the untold truth of that night, the argument in the studio that almost ended it all. Imagine a room filled with instruments, tapes, and the lingering smell of cigarettes and coffee. The clock ticks past midnight, and Michael, exhausted yet unyielding, demands perfection in every note, every rhythm, every breath. But perfection is a fragile thing. The producers, led by Quincy Jones, a man known for his patience and precision, are equally unyielding, insisting on deadlines and compromises that Michael refuses to make. The friction is instantaneous. A misplaced drum hit, a questioned chord, a disputed lyric, each small spark threatens to ignite a wildfire. And then it happens. A word shouted, a door slammed, and suddenly the room is no longer a creative haven. It is a battlefield, and in that battle, nothing is certain. Every second feels like a gamble. Could this legendary album survive the storm brewing inside the studio walls? Or would this night become the hidden chapter of what might have been? A record never finished? A career nearly broken? A genius thwarted by his own ambition and the pressures around him? By the end of this story, we'll reveal the shocking truths hidden behind the music, the fights that pushed boundaries, and the decisions that changed music history forever. But first, we step into the chaos, into the tension, into the heart of the argument that almost destroyed Thriller. The creation of Thriller wasn't supposed to be easy. Every hit song in music history comes with its own legend, its own mythos, but few albums were born under such immense pressure. Michael Jackson had returned from the massive success of Off the Wall, and expectations were astronomical. The label wanted another record to dominate the charts, to redefine pop music, and to cement Michael's place as the king of pop forever. But the stakes were more than commercial. They were deeply personal. Michael had tasted success, yes, but he hungered for perfection, for something that transcended fame. Enter the studio, a space meant for creation, yet brimming with tension. Michael arrived with an almost obsessive focus, every detail premeditated. He knew exactly how he wanted each song to feel, each note to hit, each rhythm to pulse with precision. And yet, the team surrounding him, Quincy Jones, sound engineers, arrangers, co-writers, came with their own expertise, their own instincts, and their own visions. Each session became a collision of wills. The pressure was compounded by time. Deadlines loomed. Epic Records demanded not just excellence, but speed. The label executives, distant and unseen, pushed for commercial hits, fearing that delay would mean failure. And in this storm, Michael's perfectionism became both a shield and a weapon. Every note he rejected, every vocal take he re-recorded, every mix he scrutinized with obsessive precision, added friction. But it wasn't just logistics or deadlines that threatened the album. It was the human element. Personality clashes, differing creative philosophies, and the weight of expectation collided in the studio like thunder. Quincy Jones, calm and methodical, attempted to mediate, to guide, to balance the scales between genius and practicality. Yet Michael's vision often left no room for compromise. And it was here, in this crucible of sound and tension, that the seeds of the fateful argument were planted. As the night deepened, so did the pressure. Every interaction carried the weight of consequence. Every disagreement hinted at disaster. And lurking just beneath the surface was an unspoken question. Could collaboration survive when brilliance demanded control and control demanded rebellion? One wrong word, one misunderstood intention, and everything could collapse, and collapse almost did. The argument began almost imperceptibly. A question about a drum pattern, a comment about a vocal run, and suddenly the air shifted. Michael's gaze sharpened. His voice rose, not in anger, but in the urgency of his vision. Quincy, trained to handle the pressure of legends, tried to calm the situation, to steer the conversation back to productivity. But the spark had ignited, voices collided. Words flew with the precision of thrown daggers. Michael accused, the producers defended, and the room became a charged battlefield of creative tension. It wasn't personal, at least not entirely. It was about art. Every note rejected felt like a betrayal. Every insistence on compromise felt like an insult. And the tension was magnified by exhaustion. The hours had been long, the stakes impossibly high, and the line between passion and frustration blurred. But what made this night extraordinary wasn't just the argument. It was the intensity of the personalities involved. Michael Jackson was a perfectionist, yes, but also a visionary who refused to accept mediocrity. Quincy Jones was a master of sound, yet he had never faced someone whose imagination was as relentless, as uncompromising as Michael's. And in that collision, the atmosphere in the studio became almost unbearable. It said that history is often made in moments of crisis. This was one of them. As tensions escalated, instruments were abandoned mid-track, tapes were paused, and the room fell into a charged silence between bursts of argument. Every person present knew that the next decision could either salvage the album or destroy it. And yet amidst the chaos there was an electric energy, a current of creativity born from conflict. Then came the turning point of that argument, a disagreement over a single, seemingly minor detail, a vocal flourish that Michael insisted on, but that the team feared would ruin the rhythm. The debate grew louder, more personal. Threats of walking out were whispered. Promises of compromise were rejected. And in that moment, it became clear that this was no ordinary disagreement. This was a storm, one that had the power to undo months of work and potentially to derail the very album that would later become the world's best-selling record. The room had reached its breaking point. And then, just as quickly as it had ignited, the storm paused, leaving everyone in suspended uncertainty. A question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Who would yield first, and at what cost? The answer, when it came, would not only define the future of the album, but reveal a side of Michael Jackson that few ever witnessed, an unyielding drive, a brilliance sharpened by conflict, and a willingness to risk everything for art. The argument had paused, but the tension lingered like smoke in the air, unseen but undeniable. The room, littered with instruments, cables, and half-finished tracks, became a battlefield where every sound carried stakes higher than most could comprehend. Michael Jackson, exhausted yet relentless, leaned over the piano, fingers hovering above the keys, eyes locked on the notes he could hear in his mind, but that refused to exist on tape. Each beat, each inflection mattered. For him, music was not just sound. It was emotion made tangible, a living thing that demanded perfection. But perfection is rarely a solitary journey. Across the studio, Quincy Jones and the engineering team argued over arrangements and rhythm sections. A chord here, a snare placement there, each adjustment, no matter how minor, threatened to undermine Michael's vision. And Michael, feeling misunderstood, pushed back harder. Voices escalated. Calm suggestions became sharp critiques. Sharp critiques became pointed accusations. What began as a discussion about sound had morphed into a struggle over artistic authority. In the middle of this storm, co-writers and arrangers watched helplessly as two forces of genius clashed. Each side believed they were right. Each side feared compromise would dilute brilliance. The argument wasn't just about one song. It was about the very identity of Thriller. Michael's insistence on innovation collided with the practical concerns of the production team. Could a song break conventional structures without alienating the audience? Could experimental sounds harmonize with commercial sensibilities? Each question seemed simple, yet each carried the potential to derail the album entirely. And then came the flashpoint, a vocal take that Michael insisted was essential to the emotional core of the track. Quincy and the producers, however, feared that it disrupted the rhythm, that it would alienate listeners who expected the polished perfection of Michael's previous work. Words were exchanged that could have shattered any ordinary collaboration. Raised voices, pointed fingers, and the unspoken threat of abandonment hung in the air. But it wasn't just about artistic difference. It was about trust. Michael felt the team doubted his instincts. They felt he disregarded their experience. And in that mutual suspicion, the spark of disaster ignited. The air grew thick with frustration and anticipation. Each second felt like a ticking clock counting down to collapse. And yet, amidst the chaos, something remarkable began to emerge. A creative energy unlike any the team had ever witnessed. Conflict had become a crucible. The tension was forging not destruction, but transformation. Just as the argument seemed to reach its peak, Michael paused, breathing heavily, eyes scanning the room for compromise. But no one moved. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. And in that pause, a deeper question lingered, one that would shape the night and the album. Could brilliance survive when every personality involved was pulling in a different direction? Or was this clash the beginning of the end? Before anyone could answer, a subtle disturbance at the edge of the room went unnoticed. A whispered rumor, a quiet voice, something, or someone, was about to complicate everything even further. Unseen by most, the tension inside the studio had not grown naturally. There were forces beyond the immediate clash, quiet and deliberate, manipulating the storm. Industry rumors, gossip, and subtle nudges from outsiders had crept into the studio like shadows. Every frustrated glance, every raised voice, every misinterpreted comment was amplified by whispers that no one dared openly acknowledge. And then came the revelation: someone may have been actively stoking the conflict. A producer with a hidden agenda, a rival hoping for a stumble, a studio assistant relaying information incorrectly. The possibilities were endless, and each one carried the potential for disaster. Michael, immersed in his vision, was unaware that the friction was no longer purely creative. The very fabric of the project was being tested by invisible hands. Quincy Jones, ever the diplomat, sensed something amiss. He noticed moments where conversations were redirected, where opinions seemed unnaturally firm, where advice from the edges of the room carried an unusual weight. But he could not yet pinpoint the source. The more he tried to mediate, the more the argument seemed to spiral. And Michael, already on edge, began to suspect, though he could not say what, that the chaos might not be entirely organic. This is where paranoia meets genius. When someone as meticulous as Michael Jackson senses manipulation, every note, every suggestion, every correction becomes a potential threat. Trust eroded rapidly, creating small fissures in relationships that had previously seemed unshakable. Engineers whispered to co-writers. Co-writers whispered to arrangers. Every decision became a political act, and every creative choice became fraught with suspicion. Then, a critical incident nearly broke the night. A misplaced lyric sheet, a misunderstood instruction, a tape accidentally spliced incorrectly, any of these could have been dismissed as accident. But Michael, seeing a pattern, suspected deliberate sabotage. The room, already taut, grew electrically charged with fear and mistrust. Could the album survive if the very people entrusted with it might be working against it, even unconsciously? And yet, even as doubts grew, a strange clarity began to emerge. Michael's genius thrived in conflict. He could sense which sparks were destructive and which were catalytic. And in that sense, he began to harness the chaos rather than succumb to it. But the question remained, who was the saboteur and what was their ultimate goal? Would this hidden presence force the album into compromise, or worse, destroy it entirely? The night stretched on, every argument and misunderstanding sharpening the edge of possibility. Creativity and sabotage danced dangerously close, each feeding the other. Michael, fatigued but resolute, knew instinctively that yielding now meant losing control of not just a song, but of history itself. And yet, the more he pressed forward, the more unpredictable the night became. Just as the studio seemed to reach a fragile equilibrium, a subtle, almost invisible action threatened to shatter it all. Someone or something was about to tip the scales. The king of pop, the visionary whose talent had already transformed music, was moments away from a revelation that would either save the album or doom it forever. And in that revelation lay the next spark of tension, the kind that would redefine not just a single song, but the trajectory of an entire career. The clock had long since passed midnight. The studio lights flickered with exhaustion, casting long shadows across a room filled with instruments, tapes, and the ghosts of near misses. Michael Jackson, drained but relentless, continued pacing, humming, sometimes pausing to belt a note so precise it could cut glass. Hours of debate, re-recording, and conflict had left the team frayed, yet the music had begun to take on a strange, almost supernatural energy. This was the hour when genius and madness intersect. Voices echoed across the room, some raised in frustration, others whispered in quiet desperation. Each member of the team wrestled with fatigue, fear, and the weight of ambition. Every minor mistake became a spark. Every suggestion carried enormous consequence. The night had become a crucible, testing endurance, creativity, and loyalty. Michael's perfectionism, once inspiring, now teetered on the edge of obsession. He demanded the impossible, not out of ego, but from an unshakable belief that music could transcend entertainment, that it could touch the soul. And the team, exhausted yet unwilling to surrender, tried to match his intensity. Quincy's patience, legendary though it was being pushed to its limits. A misplaced snare drum, a missed cue, a questioned note. Every small fault could ignite another explosion. The argument from earlier had not dissipated. It had evolved. Now it was subtle, threaded into every decision, every correction, every glance. Tension wrapped around the room like a living entity. Some engineers muttered quietly to each other, discussing potential compromises, while co-writers tiptoed around Michael's moods, aware that a wrong word might set off another storm. And yet, within this chaos, something miraculous began to emerge. The midnight hours revealed unexpected brilliance. Michael experimented with rhythms no one dared try, vocal runs that defied convention, arrangements that balanced complexity with accessibility. In the eye of the storm, creativity flourished. The argument, the fatigue, the pressure, they were catalysts, pushing every participant beyond their normal limits. Then, a pivotal moment occurred. Michael insisted on re-recording a vocal segment, one that had been debated and nearly discarded. Quincy objected, fearing the timing would ruin the track's flow. Words rose, voices clashed, frustration mounted. For a moment, the night seemed poised on the edge of collapse. But then something remarkable happened. A sudden alignment, a compromise that no one anticipated. Michael found a way to incorporate the change while preserving rhythm, and the team, exhausted but exhilarated, recognized that the night had produced something extraordinary. But just as relief began to settle, a new complication appeared. A miscommunication over a tape cue threatened to erase a critical vocal take. Panic flashed across the room. Had all this progress been for nothing? One wrong move, one wrong hand, and months of work could vanish. The tension spiked again, reminding everyone that in the studio, nothing was guaranteed. As the hour grew later, fatigue and obsession intertwined. Michael, alone for a brief moment, whispered to himself, testing a note, imagining the audience, envisioning perfection. Outside, the world slept, unaware that history was being forged in a room thick with conflict, sweat, and inspiration. And yet the question hung in the air. Could brilliance survive the night, or would exhaustion and human error finally tip the scales? The turning point didn't arrive with a grand announcement or a cinematic crescendo. It arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a shift of perception, a moment of clarity that changed everything. Michael, exhausted and tense, stopped mid-phrase and listened. Really listened. The argument, the chaos, the near sabotage, all of it suddenly made sense. He could feel the pulse of the album, the life in each track, and he understood precisely where the tension had been productive and where it had been destructive. Quincy Jones noticed it first. The change in Michael's demeanor, The calm intensity, the laser-focused energy replacing reactive frustration. Michael began making decisions not out of defiance or obsession, but out of insight. He could now see which ideas would elevate the album and which would simply feed conflict. And with that clarity, the studio, once a war zone, began to function as a creative machine. The team rallied. The engineers adjusted their approach, anticipating Michael's vision rather than resisting it. Co-writers stepped forward with renewed confidence, trusting his instincts. Even the lingering presence of outside interference, the whispered rumors, the subtle manipulations, lost power in the face of Michael's newfound decisiveness. It was as though the storm had cleared, leaving a brilliant clarity in its wake, and yet the night was far from over. The turning point was fragile, balanced on the edge of fatigue and high stakes. Michael pushed the team harder than ever, demanding that every note, every harmony, every rhythm reflect his vision perfectly. But now, unlike before, they followed willingly, recognizing the brilliance they were helping to manifest. What had once been a clash became a collaboration. Tension transformed into creative energy, conflict harnessed as fuel for artistry. But this new alignment came with its own risk. Michael's intensity was a double-edged sword. The longer the night continued, the greater the danger of exhaustion-induced mistakes. One missed beat, one misrecorded line, and all the progress could crumble. The team was acutely aware that brilliance and disaster were separated by a razor-thin margin. Then came a revelation. Michael, in a quiet moment, experimented with a vocal layering technique no one had attempted before. It was daring, almost reckless, and at first it sounded chaotic. But within that chaos was the heartbeat of something revolutionary. Quincy and the team held their breath. Could this risk pay off? Could a method that seemed destined for failure create the magic that would define an era? As the first playback rang through the studio, the tension shifted again, but this time in the opposite direction. The dissonance resolved itself into harmony. The track that had nearly broken the team became one of the album's defining moments. Michael's intuition had not just saved the song, it had elevated it. The turning point had arrived, and yet, even in triumph, the story was not finished. The midnight madness had pushed everyone to their limits, but questions lingered. Who had attempted to sabotage progress and why? Could the lessons learned this night withstand the pressures of final production, marketing, and public scrutiny? The answers remained just out of reach, keeping the suspense alive, even as victory seemed close. For Michael Jackson and his team, the turning point was more than a creative breakthrough. It was a moment of survival, a test of endurance, and a reminder that genius often emerges from conflict. And it set the stage for the next challenge, transforming this brilliance into the album that would change the world forever. The studio, once a battlefield of voices and frustration, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The argument, the sabotage, and the midnight tension had given way to a remarkable alignment of minds. Michael Jackson's vision, sharp and unyielding, began to transform the album from a collection of songs into a living, breathing revolution of sound. Every beat, every rhythm, every vocal layer pulsed with intention. This was no longer just a recording session. It was an experiment in creativity itself. Michael pushed the team to explore uncharted territory. Drum machines blended seamlessly with live percussion, bass lines intertwined with strings, and synthesizers sang in ways no one had dared attempt before. He demanded textures that were unheard of, harmonies that challenged convention, and rhythms that forced the listener to experience sound as movement. Quincy Jones, ever the maestro, recognized the significance. He had worked with greats before, but never had he witnessed tension and conflict convert into such unprecedented musical innovation. The techniques they developed that night would not only define Thriller but would influence pop music for decades. Every challenge, every near disaster, every personal clash had forced them to push beyond safety, beyond expectation, beyond the familiar. One track in particular became emblematic of this revolution. It had been a source of endless argument, a point of contention that almost destroyed the session. But Michael, fueled by the midnight insights and the crucible of tension, transformed it into a masterpiece. The layering of vocals, the interplay of percussion, And the daring tempo changes became a blueprint for what Thriller could be, a soundscape that was bold, unpredictable, and magnetic. Yet the revolution came at a cost. Long hours, relentless perfectionism, and the emotional intensity of creation stretched every team member to their limits. Voices, once sharp with frustration, now resonated with exhaustion and awe. Engineers, co-writers, and producers all realized they were participating in something unprecedented, but the strain was visible. Hands trembled over equipment. Eyes were bloodshot from fatigue, and tension lingered like a shadow at the edges of every session. Even as the music soared, subtle dangers remained. A misplaced note, a single misstep in the delicate layering could undo hours of work. And outside the studio, the world remained unaware of the invisible forces at play, the whispered rumors, the subtle sabotage, the personal conflicts that had nearly derailed the project. Every day of recording was a tightrope walk, balancing genius against exhaustion, innovation against chaos, ambition against human limits. As the team reached a fragile rhythm, the sense of triumph was tempered by a lingering question. Could they sustain this level of brilliance without burning out? Could the energy that created the album also destroy the very people who made it? The answer remained uncertain, and the suspense hung over the studio like an electric charge, promising both inspiration and peril. Innovation and creativity were intoxicating, but they came with an invisible toll. Michael Jackson's brilliance was unmatched, yet it demanded extraordinary sacrifice. Every track on Thriller reflected not just talent, but the emotional, mental, and physical cost of achieving perfection. The long hours, the relentless pursuit of ideal sound, and the weight of expectation pushed everyone to the brink. Michael himself bore the heaviest burden. His body and voice were stretched to limits that few could endure. He sang take after take, experimenting with nuances so subtle that only he could perceive their impact. His perfectionism, though inspiring, often made him his own harshest critic, and yet he refused to relent. To yield now would be to compromise not just a song, but his legacy, and he could not and would not allow that. The rest of the team paid a price as well. Quincy Jones, who had navigated the tempests of creative giants before, found himself exhausted in ways he had never experienced. Co-writers, arrangers, and engineers sacrificed sleep, comfort, and personal well-being to keep pace with Michael's vision. The emotional strain was palpable. Arguments flared even in moments of progress, because the stakes were so high that minor disagreements threatened to tip the balance between triumph and collapse. Yet, even in this crucible, a remarkable phenomenon emerged. The very pressure that could have destroyed the team instead fueled their greatest work. Exhaustion became focus, frustration became innovation, and conflict became a spark for ingenuity. The emotional intensity, though draining, was inseparable from the brilliance of the final product. Every note on Thriller bore the imprint of struggle, the evidence of minds pushed to the limit, and the echoes of a creative fire forged in tension. Still, the personal costs lingered. Relationships frayed under the pressure, whispers of discontent circulated, and the specter of burnout loomed. Some questioned whether the price was worth it. Could the world truly appreciate the labor behind the music, the emotional sacrifices hidden behind every harmony? Could the album survive beyond the studio and resonate with listeners while the creators themselves risked being consumed by it? And yet, despite all of this, there was a deep, unspoken understanding among the team. The price was high, yes, but the outcome was unprecedented. They were crafting history, and history required struggle, tension, and relentless commitment. The argument that had almost destroyed Thriller, the midnight chaos, the hidden sabotage, all of it had contributed to the genius now being realized in the recordings. But as exhaustion set in, subtle dangers remained. Michael's relentless drive could push him, and the team, beyond what was sustainable. And while the music now soared with unprecedented clarity and emotion, one lingering uncertainty remained. Could the fragile balance between genius and human endurance hold until the album was finished? Or would the next mistake, the next misstep, the next clash threaten to undo everything they had achieved? The price of genius, it seemed, was never fully calculable. It was measured in sleepless nights, frayed nerves, strained relationships, and the quiet, invisible toll of pushing beyond human limits. And yet, in the heart of that struggle, Michael Jackson and his team discovered a truth that would resonate far beyond the studio walls. Brilliance often demands sacrifice, and history is rarely made without cost. Even as the night drew on, the album began to take shape, glowing with promise and potential. But the question lingered like a shadow. Would the sacrifices made be enough to carry Thriller into immortality, or had the night exposed fractures that could still unravel the masterpiece before it reached the world? In the quiet aftermath of chaos, when exhaustion and tension had reached their peak, something extraordinary occurred. The studio, which had been a battlefield of voices, egos, and creative conflicts, seemed to hold its breath. Michael Jackson, weary but unbroken, paused in the center of the room. The instruments lay silent, the team leaned back, and a strange stillness descended. It was in this fragile calm that epiphany struck. For months, ideas had clashed, arguments had flared, and perfection had demanded relentless compromise. Yet now, Michael suddenly saw the invisible threads connecting everything: the rhythms, the harmonies, the subtle interplay of instruments that had been arguing for their place in the mix. He realized how minor changes, dismissed earlier in frustration, could transform entire tracks. It was as if the album had been speaking to him all along, waiting for him to listen closely enough to understand its true shape. Quincy Jones watched quietly, sensing the shift. He had witnessed countless moments of insight in great artists, but this was different. There was an almost mystical clarity in Michael's eyes, a precision in his voice, a quiet intensity that suggested he could now hear the music exactly as it was meant to exist. Beyond ego, beyond compromise, beyond exhaustion. Every note, every beat, every inflection would be refined, not through conflict, but through a vision sharpened by all the struggle that had come before. This epiphany was not just technical, it was deeply emotional. Michael recognized that tension and chaos had not been obstacles but catalysts. The very disagreements and arguments that had threatened the album's existence had forced him, and everyone around him, to confront the boundaries of their creativity. He understood that the conflict, the sabotage, and the midnight madness had shaped the genius in ways that smooth collaboration never could. The revelation sparked a flurry of action. Vocal takes were reimagined, arrangements restructured, harmonies layered with precision previously thought impossible. The team, inspired by Michael's clarity, moved with a synchronized intensity. Each member contributed with renewed confidence, no longer questioning, no longer doubting. The studio became a hive of controlled energy, a crucible where raw talent was refined into brilliance. But even as this epiphany unfolded, uncertainty lingered. The night was still young, and perfection was a moving target. Each new idea, no matter how inspired, carried risk. A misstep could undo hours of painstaking work. And Michael, knowing the stakes, continued to push the team further. The energy was intoxicating, but it carried the weight of history. Every decision now held the power to define not just a track, but the legacy of an album destined to become the greatest in music history. And yet, in the midst of this creative fever, a quiet suspense remained. Could the team sustain this brilliance until the final track was complete? Or would exhaustion, hidden sabotage, or a single misjudgment undo the epiphany before it could fully transform Thriller? The climax of the night arrived without warning. It was not heralded by fanfare, but by a series of small, critical moments that coalesced into a tension so intense it felt almost tangible. The argument, the sabotage, the exhaustion, and the midnight revelations all converged in a single moment that would define the album, and perhaps the career of Michael Jackson himself. It began with a final recording of the track that had caused the most conflict. The room was silent, save for the hum of equipment and Michael's voice, calm but precise. Every member of the team held their breath. Weeks of tension, frustration, and exhaustion had led to this point. If the take succeeded, it would elevate the album beyond anything imaginable. If it failed, all the risk, all the sacrifice, all the genius of the night would be for nothing. As the music played back, the room shifted from suspense to awe. Every note, every harmony, every rhythm resonated with a clarity and power previously thought unattainable. Michael's vocal layering, once the subject of heated argument, now shimmered perfectly with the percussion and synths. The tension that had nearly destroyed the track became the very force that drove it to brilliance. Quincy Jones, normally composed, allowed himself a rare smile. The team recognized what had happened. Conflict and chaos, harnessed correctly, had created art that transcended their expectations. The genius of Michael Jackson, sharpened by adversity, had turned the album into something legendary, but even in triumph, suspense lingered. The studio was still a fragile ecosystem. One misplaced note, one overlooked rhythm, could threaten the final take. The team worked with precision and urgency, adjusting, refining, and perfecting. Every decision was amplified by the knowledge that they were not just creating songs, they were creating history. Then came the moment that defined the night, the final playback of the completed track. The music filled the studio, resonating in every corner, saturating the air with a power and emotion that stunned everyone present. Michael listened, eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. Every argument, every frustration, every act of perseverance crystallized in that sound. It was more than a song. It was a triumph forged in fire, a testament to human genius, determination, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that moment, the team realized the truth. Thriller would survive. Not only survive, but revolutionize music, defy expectations, and cement Michael Jackson as a cultural icon. The arguments that had threatened to destroy it had, paradoxically, made it stronger. The midnight chaos, the hidden sabotage, the exhaustion, all had contributed to a sound so vivid, so electric, so timeless, that it would resonate with generations to come. Yet even as triumph settled in, a final layer of suspense remained. The world had not heard this story. The argument, the tension, the sabotage, they were secrets hidden behind the music. And the question lingered. If one night could have changed everything, how many other moments in history had been shaped by unseen battles, by invisible forces, by the delicate balance between genius and chaos? Michael Jackson, exhausted but elated, stepped back from the console, aware that this night, this crucible of emotion, conflict, and brilliance had transformed not only the album, but himself. The studio, once a battlefield, now stood as a monument to the power of perseverance, creativity, and the human spirit. And as the first notes of the completed track faded into the night, a quiet realization settled over everyone present. History had been made, not in spite of conflict, but because of it. The night that almost ended, Thriller had instead defined it, and in that crucible of tension and triumph, Michael Jackson had proven once again that genius is never easy, and history is never created without struggle. As the first echoes of the final track faded into silence, the studio remained still, the weight of what had just been accomplished settling over everyone like a quiet, profound storm. There were no cheers, no applause, only the knowledge that something extraordinary had been created. The tension that had gripped the room, the arguments that had threatened to destroy the album, the hidden sabotage, and the exhaustion, all had culminated in a sound that would forever redefine popular music. Michael Jackson, usually restless even in moments of triumph, allowed himself to breathe. He stood in the center of the studio, eyes scanning the team, a faint smile hinting at relief but tinged with the gravity of the night's work. This was not simply a victory over external pressures. It was a victory over the human limits of endurance, over the conflicts of ego and opinion, and over the invisible forces that had sought to derail the creative process. Every note on the album now carried the imprint of struggle, the echo of a night where genius was tested, and the undeniable proof that brilliance can emerge from chaos. The emotional impact of the night extended beyond the studio walls. For Michael and his team, it was more than a recording session. It was a crucible that revealed the cost of creation, The depth of dedication required to transcend mediocrity, and the fragility of collaboration under extreme pressure. Friendships were tested, tempers flared, and exhaustion threatened to undo the work entirely. Yet, paradoxically, it was precisely these pressures that gave Thriller its life, its intensity, and its soul. Every clash, every heated debate, every sleepless hour contributed to a record that was not just heard, but felt. Quincy Jones, standing quietly beside Michael, reflected on the journey. He had guided great artists before, but none had demanded, challenged, and inspired the team in the way Michael had. He had seen frustration transform into brilliance, doubt into clarity, and tension into a creative force capable of reshaping an entire industry. The lessons of that night would linger far beyond the studio. Lessons about the delicate balance between control and collaboration, between persistence and flexibility, between ego and vision. And yet, the story was not simply one of triumph. The night had exacted a price, subtle but undeniable. Long hours had taken a toll on voices, minds, and relationships. Exhaustion and stress had tested even the strongest members of the team. Michael himself had stretched his body and voice to extremes, pushing boundaries that few could survive without cost. The price of genius was written in fatigue, in tension, in the quiet moments of self-doubt that no one outside the studio would ever witness. But in that tension lay a profound truth. Greatness often demands sacrifice. History is rarely made without struggle. And in this night of near catastrophe, the creation of Thriller revealed the paradox of artistic genius, where conflict and chaos, rather than undermining creativity, became the very force that fueled it. Each argument, each moment of doubt, each flash of frustration became a spark that ignited inspiration, resulting in music that would echo across generations. The emotional resonance of this night extended beyond technical mastery. It revealed the humanity of those involved, their vulnerabilities. The producer's meticulous guidance was not stubbornness. It was stewardship of genius. And the team's endurance was not merely labor. It was devotion to a vision that would change the world. Even as the album neared completion, the lingering question remained. Would the world understand the magnitude of the struggle behind the music? Millions would hear Thriller, be moved by its innovation, its emotion, and its perfection. But few would know of the battles fought in dimly lit studios. The arguments that almost ended history, the sabotage, the exhaustion, and the relentless pursuit of brilliance. Yet, for those present, the knowledge was unforgettable. They had witnessed the transformation of tension into triumph, of chaos into creativity, and of human limitation into musical immortality. The story also left a subtle, haunting lesson. Genius is not fragile because it is weak. It is fragile because it is rare, precious, and tested. Michael Jackson's night in the studio was a testament to the delicate balance between inspiration and destruction. One wrong note, one unresolved argument, one moment of exhaustion could have undone it all. But through resilience, intuition, and relentless focus, the album survived, and in surviving, it became legendary. As the night drew to a close, Michael stepped away from the console, exhausted but enlightened. The team shared a quiet acknowledgement of what had been achieved. There were no celebrations yet. The world was still asleep, unaware that music history had been forged in the dim light of a studio where tension and chaos had collided to create perfection. And in that quiet moment, a sense of reverence settled over everyone present. The understanding that they had participated in something far greater than themselves, something eternal, the narrative of Thriller's creation, often told as a story of triumph and innovation, is incomplete without this hidden chapter. It is a story of conflict, endurance, sacrifice, and revelation, a story of how genius almost faltered under pressure, only to emerge stronger, sharper, and more brilliant than ever. The argument that almost ended the album, the midnight madness, the sabotage, the relentless drive for perfection, all of it contributed to a masterpiece that would define an era, inspire millions, and cement Michael Jackson's legacy forever. And finally, as the echoes of the last playback faded into history, One truth remained: brilliance is forged in fire. Conflict, chaos, exhaustion, and pressure are not the enemies of creativity. They are its crucible. Michael Jackson and his team had endured, survived, and transformed these forces into art that would resonate across generations. The night that almost ended, Thriller became the night that immortalized it. The story concludes not with finality, but with reflection. It asks its audience to consider the unseen battles behind every great work of art, to recognize the human effort, tension, and sacrifice that shape history. It invites us to marvel not just at the outcome, but at the journey, the trials that test genius, the friction that sparks brilliance, and the courage required to persevere against seemingly impossible odds. In the end, the legacy of Thriller is inseparable from the night that nearly ended it. And in understanding that night, we glimpse the true nature of genius: fragile, demanding, dangerous, and ultimately extraordinary. It is a story that reminds us that history is rarely smooth, that brilliance is often born in conflict, and that the world's greatest achievements emerge not in spite of struggle, but because of it. And as listeners press play decades later, the music carries with it not just rhythm and melody, but the invisible heartbeat of the night that forged it, a heartbeat of tension, resilience, and triumph that will never fade. The world knows Thriller as perfection, but now we know the story behind the perfection: a night of conflict, near disaster, relentless pursuit of excellence, and a vision so unyielding that it could not fail. And in that story lies a final, haunting question: what other masterpieces in history are forged in the shadows of struggle, unknown to the world, waiting for the moment their brilliance is finally revealed?